Painting our front door a simple shade of navy blue shouldn't have led to police sirens and an IRS investigation, but in our perfect cul-de-sac, it was an act of war. My wife Sarah and I had finally done it. We'd bought our forever home. It was a charming two-story colonial at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place you see in movies where kids ride their bikes in the street until the fireflies come out. For the first 2 weeks it was pure bliss. We painted the living room, planted a small garden, and got to know our immediate neighbors, who were all perfectly pleasant, normal people. And then we met Brenda. Brenda lived in the immaculate house directly across from us, the one with the lawn that looked like a green velvet carpet and rose bushes so perfect they seemed fake. She introduced herself on our third weekend there, marching across the street with a clipboard that seemed surgically attached to her hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was, in her words, the organizer and treasurer of the Cul-de-sac Community Improvement Association. It sounded harmless enough. She explained that for a modest fee of $150 a month, the association handled all sorts of things. Coordinated lawn care services to ensure a uniform look, seasonal decorations for the entire street, a biannual block party, and even a private security patrol. She presented it as a luxury, a way to maintain the pristine, high-value character of our little enclave. "Everyone is a member," she said, her smile tightening just a fraction. "It's how we keep this place so perfect." Sarah and I exchanged a look. $150 a month? That's $1,800 a year. For what? We liked mowing our own lawn. We enjoyed picking out our own Christmas lights. And a private security patrol in a neighborhood with a near-zero crime rate seemed like a colossal waste of money. When she handed us the paperwork, which looked like something she'd typed up herself in Microsoft Word, I saw that it also included a long list of bylaws, approved mailbox colors, restrictions on garden gnomes, a mandate that all trash cans must be retrieved from the curb within 1 hour of pickup. It was less of a community association and more of a petty dictatorship. That evening, Sarah and I talked it over. It wasn't just about the money. It was the principle. We hadn't moved out of a cramped apartment with a nosy landlord just to sign up for a new one who lived across the street. We wanted the freedom to be ourselves in our own home. So the next day I walked over to Brenda's house, paperwork in hand, and politely declined. I tried to be as diplomatic as possible. "Brenda, we really appreciate the offer, and we think it's great what you're doing for the neighborhood. But Sarah and I are a bit more hands-on. We prefer to handle our own property maintenance. We'll of course be respectful of the neighborhood's aesthetic, but we're going to have to pass on joining the association." The smile on her face didn't just fade, it evaporated. It was like a mask had been ripped off, revealing a face of pure, unadulterated indignation. "Pass?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Nobody passes. This is a community. We all contribute. It's what you do." "I understand that," I said, holding my ground. "But it's not for us. We'll see you around." I turned and walked back to my house, feeling her eyes burning a hole in my back. The war had begun. The next few weeks were a masterclass in passive aggression. Our morning waves were met with a stony glare. If Brenda was outside talking to another neighbor and we walked by, the conversation would halt abruptly, followed by hushed whispers. Then came the anonymous notes. A small, neatly folded piece of paper left on our doorstep, complaining that the new wind chime we'd hung was disruptive to the neighborhood's auditory harmony. Another note appeared a week later, lamenting that our grass was 1/4 of an inch longer than everyone else's. We ignored it all. We were determined not to let this woman bully us. The final straw, the event that pushed her over the edge from passive-aggressive to full-blown lunatic, was the front door. Our door was a drab, faded beige, and we decided to paint it a beautiful, deep navy blue. We bought the best outdoor paint, the brushes, the painter's tape, the works. On a bright Saturday morning, we set up our drop cloths and got to work. We hadn't even finished the first coat when Brenda's front door flew open. She stormed across the street, her face contorted in a mask of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at our half-painted door. I put my brush down. "Good morning, Brenda. We're painting our door." "You can't do that," she screeched. "That color is not on the approved palette. It's a violation." "A violation of what?" Sarah asked, stepping in front of me. "We're not in your association, remember. This is our house. We can paint our door any color we want." Brenda's eyes bulged. "You are ruining the uniformity of this street. You are single-handedly destroying our property values. I am warning you, stop this immediately." "No," I said firmly. "We're not stopping. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a door to finish. Please get off our property." She stood there, vibrating with rage, for a solid 10 seconds. Then she spun around, whipped out her phone, and marched back to her lawn. "You'll be sorry," she hissed over her shoulder. "You'll see." We shrugged it off and went back to painting, assuming it was an empty threat. About 20 minutes later, we heard the sirens. 2 police cars, lights flashing, pulled into our quiet little cul-de-sac and stopped directly in front of our house. 2 officers got out, their expressions grim, and walked up our driveway. Brenda stood on her perfect lawn, arms crossed with a triumphant smirk on her face. The lead officer looked at the paint cans, at our half-painted door, and then at us. He cleared his throat. "Sir, ma'am," he said, his hand resting on his belt. "We've received a report of property destruction and threatening behavior. I'm going to need you to put the paintbrushes down and tell me exactly what's going on here." My heart pounded in my chest. Property destruction? Threatening behavior? I glanced at Brenda, who was practically preening on her lawn. This was her move. A calculated nuclear option to humiliate and intimidate us into submission. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Officers," I began, my voice steady. "There seems to be a huge misunderstanding. This is our home. We were simply painting our front door." "She," Sarah added, gesturing with her head towards Brenda, "came onto our property and started screaming at us because she doesn't approve of the color." The second officer, a younger man with a weary expression, looked over at Brenda. "Ma'am, is that true?" Brenda's face flushed. "They were being aggressive, and that color is a violation of the Cul-de-sac Community Improvement Association bylaws," she yelled back. The lead officer sighed, a deep, tired sound that suggested this wasn't his first ridiculous neighbor dispute of the day. He turned his gaze back to me. "Are you part of this association, sir?" "No, sir," I replied. "We politely declined to join. There's no official HOA here. It's a voluntary club she runs." A flicker of understanding crossed the officer's face. He knew the type. He walked to the edge of our lawn and addressed Brenda directly. "Ma'am, this is their private property. They can paint their door any color they choose. And this is not a police matter. Calling 911 for something like this ties up resources for actual emergencies. Do not call us again unless there is a legitimate threat or crime being committed." The triumphant smirk on Brenda's face dissolved into a mask of pure disbelief, then twisted into rage. She sputtered, trying to form a sentence, but the officer had already turned his back on her. He tipped his hat to us. "Sorry to have bothered you folks. Have a good day." As the police cars pulled away, the silence they left behind was deafening. Several neighbors who had been peeking through their blinds now openly stared. Brenda, looking like a defeated villain in a cheap play, shot us a look of pure hatred before storming back into her perfect house and slamming the door. We had won the battle, but I had a sinking feeling the war was about to get much, much worse. The navy blue door became a symbol of our defiance, and Brenda made sure we paid for it. The anonymous notes became a daily occurrence. One complained that our porch light was too yellow. Another claimed our car, parked in our own driveway, was leaking oil onto the pristine concrete, which was a blatant lie. She would stand at her window with a pair of binoculars watching us. It was unnerving. She started a smear campaign with the other neighbors, telling them we were troublemakers who were deliberately trying to lower everyone's property values. One evening we saw her holding what looked like an emergency meeting on her front lawn with a few of the other cul-de-sac residents. She was pointing frantically at our house, her voice a shrill, angry buzz we could hear even through our closed windows. Most of the neighbors looked uncomfortable, but a couple of them, her clear cronies, nodded along with grim faces. We were being ostracized on our own street. It was Sarah who finally cracked. "I can't take this," she said one night, her voice trembling. I feel like a prisoner in our own home. She's watching our every move. What are we going to do? I knew we couldn't just keep ignoring it. Brenda wasn't going to stop. She was obsessed. We had to find a way to fight back, but on our own terms. I kept coming back to the association. The money. $1,800 a year, from what looked like at least 8 other houses in the cul-de-sac. Where was all that money going? The shared lawn service was one guy on a riding mower who spent maybe 20 minutes on each lawn. The private security was a teenager in a beat-up Honda who drove through once a night. It didn't add up. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I sat down at my computer. A pit of unease churned in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a burning sense of indignation. I started with a simple search for the Cul-de-sac Community Improvement Association. Nothing. No official website, no registration, nothing. I widened my search, looking for any registered business or non-profit under Brenda's name in our state. Again, a complete blank. My heart started beating a little faster. An association that collects dues, especially that amount of money, should have some kind of legal structure. An LLC, a non-profit designation, something. It would need a business bank account to deposit the checks. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking on the empty search results page. There was no official record of this association anywhere. It was like it didn't exist outside of that clipboard Brenda carried around. Then a thought, cold and sharp, cut through my frustration. What if it didn't exist? What if there was no association bank account? I pulled up our county's property records, which are public information. I looked up every house on the cul-de-sac, cross-referencing the owners' names. Then I went to social media, finding profiles for most of them. It was a long shot, but I was looking for a connection. And then I found it. The lawn guy? His last name was the same as Brenda's maiden name. He was her nephew. The kid driving the security Honda? His profile picture showed him at a family barbecue, arm in arm with Brenda, her son. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. The inflated fees, the lack of transparency, the amateur, self-made paperwork. It wasn't a community fund. It was a family slush fund, a personal piggy bank she was filling by intimidating her neighbors into paying her. She wasn't just a power-tripping bully. She was a con artist. I leaned back in my chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. Brenda had wanted a war. She had no idea the kind of battle she had just started. She thought a can of paint was a violation. I had just discovered a violation that carried a hell of a lot more than a disapproving note. The next morning, I laid it all out for Sarah over breakfast. The unregistered association, the family connections to the services, the sheer amount of untaxed cash likely flowing directly into Brenda's personal bank account. Her initial shock quickly morphed into the same steely resolve I was feeling. The victim mentality was gone, replaced by a righteous anger. Brenda hadn't just harassed us, she was actively defrauding our neighbors, people who trusted her. "So what's the plan?" Sarah asked, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Are we going to go door to door and tell everyone?" I shook my head. "No. Not yet. It would just be our word against hers. She'd twist it. Say we're vindictive liars because we didn't want to pay the fees. We need proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof." And so began our counter-operation. It felt almost cloak and dagger. I installed a new security camera on our porch, one with crystal-clear audio, pointed not just at our property, but with a wide-angle view of the street. It was advertised for neighborhood security, which felt beautifully ironic. We started documenting everything. Every note she left was photographed and filed. Every time she stood on her lawn glaring at our house, we made a note of the date and time. We were building a case file. The key, I knew, was the money. I needed to know how she was collecting it. One afternoon, I saw our neighbor from 2 doors down, a quiet retiree named Mr. Henderson, walking over to Brenda's house with an envelope in his hand. I waited until he was on his way back and casually went out to check our mail. "Afternoon, Mr. Henderson," I said with a friendly smile. "Beautiful day." He nodded politely. "That it is." "I hope you don't mind me asking," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "But I saw you were at Brenda's. My wife and I are still on the fence about the association. and we were just curious about how the payment works. Is it a check? Bank transfer? Mr. Henderson shrugged. Oh, Brenda prefers cash. Says it's just easier to manage without all the bank fees and paperwork. I just drop off $150 in an envelope at the first of the month. He chuckled. Keeps things simple, I guess. My mind reeled. Cash. Of course it was cash. Untraceable. No paper trail. It was more brazen than I had even imagined. This wasn't just poor bookkeeping. This was textbook tax evasion. Over $14,000 a year, from the 8 other houses, paid in cash under the table. For years, probably. The scale of her little scam was staggering. Our strategy shifted. We didn't need to convince the neighbors. We needed to bring in a much bigger player. Someone who doesn't care about neighborhood drama. Someone who only cares about numbers and rules. We were going to go after her where it hurt. Her wallet. I spent the next week gathering my ammunition. I compiled all my research into a neat, professional-looking report. The lack of a registered business entity. The public records of her family members being paid for services. A detailed timeline of her harassment and intimidation tactics against us, complete with photos of the notes. The final piece was a carefully worded statement detailing my conversation with Mr. Henderson about the cash-only payments. It was all circumstantial, but when you put it all together, it painted a very ugly and very convincing picture. On a Friday morning, I made the call. It took a while to navigate the automated phone system, but I finally got through to a human being at the Internal Revenue Service. I explained that I wished to report a suspected case of tax fraud. I was transferred to an agent in the Criminal Investigation Division, a woman with a no-nonsense voice who listened patiently as I laid out the entire story, from the moment Brenda first showed up with her clipboard to my discovery of her cash-only scheme. I was careful not to sound like a bitter neighbor with a grudge. I presented the facts calmly and methodically. So, you have evidence that this individual is running an unregistered business, collecting undeclared cash income, and using it for personal and family enrichment, the agent asked when I had finished. I have a strong and well-documented suspicion, yes, I confirmed. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Thank you for the information, sir. We will look into this matter. You can submit your documentation through our online portal. I will give you the reference number. And that was it. The call ended. There was no promise of a raid, no dramatic pledge to bring her to justice. Just a calm, bureaucratic, we will look into this. For a moment I felt a pang of anticlimax. Had I just shouted into the void? For the next 2 months, life in the cul-de-sac continued its tense rhythm. Brenda seemed to have gotten bored of the note-leaving and had moved on to a new tactic. Noise. Her son would suddenly start revving the engine of his souped-up Honda at 7 in the morning. Loud music would blast from her backyard during dinner. It was petty, childish, and we did our best to ignore it. We started to wonder if anything would come of my report. Maybe Brenda's little scheme was too small time for the IRS to care about. Then, one Tuesday morning, it happened. I was in my home office, which overlooks the street, on a conference call. I saw a car pull into the cul-de-sac, a nondescript, government-issue sedan. It parked directly in front of Brenda's house. 2 people got out, a man and a woman, both dressed in bland professional suits. They weren't cops. They weren't salespeople. They walked up to Brenda's perfect front door carrying briefcases with an air of unshakable purpose. They rang the doorbell. I watched as Brenda opened the door, her usual scowl on her face, which quickly morphed into a look of confusion. The woman in the suit held up a badge. Even from across the street I could see the color drain completely from Brenda's face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. The 2 agents, their expressions as flat and unreadable as stone, spoke to Brenda for a few moments on her doorstep before she numbly stepped aside to let them in. The door closed and the quiet cul-de-sac was once again still, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. It was charged, electric with unspoken consequences. I ended my conference call, my focus completely shot. Sarah came and stood beside me at the window, and we watched the house across the street in silence. For 2 hours nothing happened. No shouting, no commotion. Just that bland sedan sitting at the curb like a patient predator. When the agents finally emerged, Their faces were just as impassive as before. They got back in their car and drove away as quietly as they had arrived. A few minutes later, Brenda's front door creaked open. She looked deflated. The rigid posture, the self-righteous fury that seemed to be her default state, was gone. She looked small and pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was deeply satisfying to witness. She scanned the street, her gaze locking with ours through the window. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, only a dawning, horrified realization. She knew. She knew it was us. She quickly stumbled back inside, and for the rest of the day her house was as quiet as a tomb. The fallout was not immediate and explosive, but slow and corrosive, which was even better. We didn't hear anything for weeks, but the changes in the neighborhood were palpable. Brenda became a ghost. She no longer sat on her porch judging the length of everyone's grass. The loud music stopped. Her son's car suddenly became whisper quiet. The biannual block party, which was supposed to happen that month, was indefinitely postponed, according to a hastily written sign she taped to her mailbox. The real information started to trickle in from the other neighbors. The first was Mr. Henderson. He stopped me one afternoon while I was getting the mail, a troubled look on his face. "Strange thing," he said, lowering his voice. "Brenda came by yesterday. Gave me back my $150 from this month. Said the association was being dissolved. Didn't give a reason, just handed me the cash and scurried off. Did she talk to you?" "Something like that," I said with a non-committal smile. Word spread. Everyone got their money back. The lawn service. Her nephew stopped coming. The security patrol. Her son was no more. The Cul-de-sac Community Improvement Association had vanished overnight. The flimsy dictatorship had crumbled. The true extent of Brenda's nightmare, however, came to light about a month later. We found out through another neighbor, a woman named Carol, who was a bit of a gossip, but had always been friendly to us. Apparently, Brenda had a complete meltdown during a conversation with her. The IRS wasn't just looking into things. They had launched a full-scale audit. Not just of the association, but of her and her husband's personal finances for the past 7 years. The entire time she had been running her little scam. They were demanding records for every dollar of the undeclared cash income. They were looking at the payments she made to her family members. They were questioning the source of funds for her new SUV and the lavish vacation photos she'd posted online a year ago. She was facing a mountain of back taxes, steep penalties for fraud, and, as Carol whispered with wide eyes, the possibility of actual criminal charges. Her perfect manicured world was being systematically dismantled by the consequences of her own greed and arrogance. She had called the police on us for painting a door, and in return we had sicked the single most relentless and humorless agency in the federal government on her. The ultimate victory, though, wasn't just seeing Brenda get her comeuppance. It was watching the neighborhood come back to life. Without Brenda's reign of terror, people started to relax. Someone put up a pink flamingo in their yard. Another family installed a basketball hoop over their garage. Our navy blue door was no longer an act of rebellion. It was just a door. One Saturday we were out in the yard, and a few neighbors came over to chat. They apologized for being standoffish before, admitting Brenda had pressured them into giving us the cold shoulder. We ended up having an impromptu barbecue in our backyard that evening. We met more of our neighbors in one night than we had in the previous 6 months. We were finally part of a real community, one built on genuine friendliness, not forced compliance and cash-filled envelopes. Last week, a for sale sign went up on Brenda's perfect lawn. It looks a little less perfect now. A few weeds are daring to sprout. We heard they're selling to cover the legal fees and the tax bill. I can't say I feel sorry for her. She tried to bully us, to control us, to make our lives miserable over something as trivial as the color of a door. She called the police to enforce her imaginary rules, and in doing so she inadvertently pointed a giant spotlight at her own very real crimes. Every morning I drink my coffee and look out at our navy blue door. It's a beautiful door, and it's a constant quiet reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully isn't to sink to their level, but to hand them a shovel and let them dig their own grave.